From tonight on, you exist to birth my sons. The mountain man's words hung in the air like a death sentence to the terrified young woman. His growl echoed through the cabin walls, trapping her in a nightmare she never saw coming. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the sharp scent of frost, as Mary Johnson trudged along the winding mountain path. Each labored breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Her boots crunched on frozen earth, breaking the pristine silence of the wilderness. Every step away from the city felt like shedding old wounds, layers of pain and disappointment falling away with each mile. "This is what healing looks like," she whispered to herself, adjusting the heavy backpack that contained her meager possessions. The young woman had left everything behind: her cramped apartment, her dead-end job, the memories that kept her awake at night. This mountain retreat wasn't just a vacation. It was an escape, a chance to rebuild herself in solitude. Mary paused to catch her breath, drawing the crisp mountain air deep into her lungs. The panorama before her was breathtaking. Jagged peaks cutting into a steel-gray sky, valleys carpeted with evergreens dusted in white. She pulled out her journal, quickly sketching the landscape with a few deft strokes. The pages already contained fragments of her past, but now she hoped to fill them with something new, something hopeful. Up ahead, the cabin she'd rented appeared around a bend in the trail. Its wooden frame stood weathered and battered by years of mountain storms, yet somehow resilient, much like herself, she thought with a small smile. Smoke curled from the chimney. The property manager must have prepared it for her arrival. "Home for the next month," she murmured, quickening her pace. The promise of warmth drew her forward across the final stretch of frozen ground. What Mary didn't notice was the shadow atop the ridge overlooking her path. A hulking figure stood motionless against the darkening sky, watching her approach with unblinking intensity. Robert Brown's broad shoulders were hunched against the cold, his beard crusted with ice crystals. His breath misted in the icy air as his eyes tracked her every movement. The mountain man's calloused hands tightened around the worn handle of his axe. How long had it been since he'd seen someone so perfect, so alone? The corners of his mouth twitched upward in what might have been a smile, though the expression held no warmth. "Finally," he whispered, the word immediately snatched away by the wind. In his mind, she was already his, a solution to his years of isolation, an answer to the loneliness that had twisted his thoughts into dark, possessive shapes. Robert watched as she approached the cabin, already planning when and how he would make his presence known. Mary Johnson pushed open the cabin door, wincing at the creak that echoed through the empty space. The cold had settled inside like an unwelcome guest, seeping into every corner. Her fingers, already numb from the hike, fumbled with matches until a small flame caught the kindling in the stone fireplace. As the fire grew, shadows danced across rough-hewn walls that had weathered countless mountain winters. The cabin offered little comfort, just a bed with a mattress that sagged in the middle, a table that wobbled on uneven legs, and a single window where condensation gathered like tears. Through the foggy glass, pine trees stood sentinel against the darkening sky, their silhouettes a stark reminder of how far she'd come to escape her past. "Home, sweet home," she whispered, her breath visible in the still cold air. The floorboards protested beneath her weight as she moved about the small space, unpacking the few possessions she'd brought from her former life. From her backpack emerged the essentials of her existence: a leather-bound journal with dog-eared pages, 3 sweaters worn thin at the elbows, jeans patched at the knees, and a silver frame holding a photograph. Mary paused, running her thumb across the image, herself smiling between her parents at graduation, before everything fell apart. She placed it face down on the rickety table, unable to meet those hopeful eyes. The journal found its place beside the photo. Inside were the fragments of her broken life in the city, the reasons she'd fled to this remote outpost. Writing had been her salvation during the darkest times, and she hoped these mountains would give her new words, new strength. As night descended, the fire's warmth finally reached the cabin's corners. Mary sat cross-legged on the floor, savoring the profound quiet that surrounded her. No car horns, no neighbors arguing through paper-thin walls, no reminders of failure and heartbreak. Just silence, beautiful and complete. "This is what healing sounds like," she murmured, stretching her hands toward the flames. For the first time in months, her shoulders relaxed, the knot in her chest loosening slightly. Outside, unseen in the gathering darkness, Robert Brown crouched among the trees, his broad frame hidden by shadow and pine. He'd watched her arrival with growing fascination, observed her lighting the fire through the window. His callous hand gripped a branch as he leaned forward, studying her silhouette against the firelight. "Perfect," he whispered, his deep voice lost in the wind. The mountain man's eyes never left the cabin as night fully claimed the forest. In his mind, Mary already belonged to him, another secret the mountains would keep. Robert Brown was no myth, though the townsfolk called him a ghost. Those few who claimed to have glimpsed him described a bearded, broad-shouldered figure moving between trees like a shadow. For 15 years, he had carved existence from the unforgiving mountains, building shelters with his bare hands and hunting with skills honed through desperate winters. The locals whispered his name in hushed tones at the general store. Tales of the mountain man growing more fantastic with each retelling. In truth, Robert had once walked among them. He'd come seeking isolation after returning from war, his mind fractured by violence. The mountains offered him peace at first, then became this kingdom. He'd constructed 3 cabins across the range, each more remote than the last, retreating further from humanity with each passing season. Years of solitude had twisted something vital inside him. The man who once sought escape now harbored darker needs. Companionship had morphed into possession, desire into dominion. The wilderness had shaped him into something primal, a creature of instinct and territory. From his vantage point on the ridge, Robert watched the golden light flickering through Mary Johnson's cabin window. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he observed her silhouette moving inside. Something about her stirred memories of who he'd been before the mountains claimed him. A man who understood gentleness, who knew how to speak without growling. But those memories were distant echoes now. What remained was hunger and purpose. Mary wasn't just a woman to him. She was salvation, continuation, legacy. In his isolated mind, he'd convinced himself the mountains had delivered her specifically for him. "She's the one," he muttered, his voice deep as thunder rolling through the pines. His calloused fingers tightened around the worn handle of his hunting knife. Years of tracking deer and elk had made him patient, methodical. He would watch first, learn her patterns, understand her weaknesses. Robert's eyes narrowed as Mary's shadow passed the window again. He imagined her warming his bed, bearing his children, continuing his bloodline in these mountains when his own strength failed. A smile cracked his weather-beaten face, revealing teeth yellowed by years without care. "From tonight on," he whispered to the darkness, "you exist only for me." The wind carried his words away, but the promise hung in the air like a death sentence. Robert settled deeper into his hiding spot, prepared to wait as long as necessary. The hunt had begun. Mary Johnson awoke with a jolt, her breath catching in her throat. A sharp crack had pierced the night, a branch snapping under deliberate weight. Not wind, not an animal, something else. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slid from beneath the threadbare blankets, the wooden floor ice cold against her bare feet. The cabin's silence pressed in around her, broken only by the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. Just the mountain settling, she whispered to herself. But the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Mary crept toward the window, each floorboard protesting beneath her weight. Pressing her palm against the frosted glass, she peered into the darkness. Nothing but an inky void stared back. The mountains transformed into massive, breathing sentinels that seemed to watch her every movement with ancient, patient eyes. A shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the biting cold. The isolation she'd sought now felt like a mistake, the solitude no longer healing, but threatening. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the sensation of being observed. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered, forcing a laugh that died quickly in the stillness. "This is what you wanted. Space. Silence." But outside, mere yards from the cabin wall, Robert crouched motionless in the dense undergrowth. His massive frame was perfectly still, a skill honed through years of hunting. The pale moonlight filtering through the pines caught the edge of his axe, sending a cold glint across the polished metal. The bearded man's breath came out in controlled, misty puffs as he watched her silhouette move behind the glass. His calloused fingers tightened around the axe handle, not in threat, but in anticipation. A possessive smile crept across his weathered face. He'd waited so long. Years of solitude in these mountains had carved away his humanity, leaving something primal and hungry in its place. The locals avoided him, spreading whispered warnings about the mountain man who'd gone feral. But Mary was different, young, alone, strong enough to survive, but vulnerable enough to need him, perfect to carry his legacy, to birth sons who would inherit his wilderness kingdom. "Soon," he whispered, the word dissolving into the night air. Inside, Mary returned to her bed, pulling the covers tight around her shoulders. She blamed her unease on nerves, on the transition from city noise to mountain silence. She couldn't know that Robert's eyes remained fixed on her cabin, patient as the mountains themselves, his obsession growing with each passing moment in this ruthless wilderness. The first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in hues of amber and gold. Mary Johnson stretched her stiff limbs. Grateful for the temporary reprieve that daylight offered, sleep had been fitful, haunted by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but the morning's crisp air seemed to wash away the night's unease. She pulled on her worn boots and heavy jacket, tucking her journal and a small pencil into her pocket. The cabin felt suffocating despite its spaciousness, and Mary needed to breathe, to explore, to remind herself why she had come here in the first place. The trails wound through ancient pines, their needles creating a soft carpet beneath her feet. Mary paused occasionally, perching on frost-covered rocks to sketch the jagged peaks that surrounded her. Her fingers moved deftly across the paper, capturing the harsh beauty of this untamed place. In the city, she had felt constantly watched, judged. Here the solitude should have been liberating, yet something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, too heavy. Mary found herself glancing over her shoulder, the hairs on the neck rising, despite the logical part of her brain insisting she was alone. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, voice sounding alien in the vast quietude. She had come to the mountains to heal, to escape the chaos of her past. Now, she felt like both an intruder in this pristine wilderness and, paradoxically, a prisoner of its vastness. What Mary couldn't see was Robert Brown, moving like a shadow 50 yards behind her. The mountain man's footsteps made no sound on the pine-covered ground, each placement deliberate and practiced from years of hunting. His eyes never left her slender form as she navigated the terrain with growing confidence. He admired her careful movements, the way she studied the landscape before committing to a path. Most city people blundered through, loud and careless, but Mary was different. She seemed to respect the mountains, even as she feared them. "She's the one," Robert whispered, his breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. The mountains had sent her to him. He was certain. After years of solitude, the wilderness had finally delivered what he needed. His calloused hands touched the handle of the axe at his belt, a reflexive gesture of possession. The wind shifted slightly, carrying his words away into the vastness. Mary paused in her sketching, a sudden chill running through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked around, seeing nothing but trees and snow and sky, yet feeling everything hidden beneath the surface of this beautiful, terrible place. As night fell, Mary Johnson huddled over the small fire she'd managed to build in the cabin's ancient stone hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across the weathered wooden walls as she stirred a pot of thin soup, the last of her provisions until she could venture to restock. Her stomach growled, reminding her that city conveniences were far behind her now. The cabin felt different after dark. What had seemed cozy in daylight now felt confining, the rough-hewn logs pressing inward with each creak and groan of the structure settling. Mary pulled her journal from her pack, fingers tracing the worn leather cover before opening to a fresh page. "Something feels wrong here," she wrote, pen scratching against paper. "The silence is too complete, like the forest is holding its breath." She paused, listening to the wind whisper through the gaps in the walls. "I came here to heal, but instead I feel hunted." She hadn't told anyone back home exactly where she was staying. After what happened with David, she needed complete separation. No calls, no messages, no well-meaning check-ins. The mountains were supposed to be her sanctuary, not another prison. Mary glanced at the window, its glass reflecting her own image back at her, rather than revealing what might lurk beyond. The sensation of being watched prickled at her neck, raising goosebumps along her arms. She'd grown up in rough neighborhoods. She knew what it felt like to be sized up, evaluated, targeted. "I'm being paranoid," she whispered to herself, but still moved away from the window. Outside, Robert Brown circled the perimeter of the cabin for the third time that evening. His massive frame moved with surprising grace for such a large man, each step calculated to avoid the crunch of fallen pine needles or the snap of twigs. Years of hunting had taught him patience and silence, skills that served him well now. The bearded mountain man paused, studying the golden light spilling from the cabin window. Inside, he could see her silhouette moving about, unaware of his presence. His life had been one of solitude and survival, taking what he needed from the wilderness and asking nothing more. But seeing Mary had awakened something primal in him, a hunger deeper than mere companionship. "You'll understand soon," he murmured to the night air, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "The mountains chose you for me." To Robert, she represented everything his isolated existence lacked, not just a woman, but continuation, legacy. His bloodline carried forward through sons who would inherit his knowledge of these peaks and valleys. Mary wasn't just company in his mind. She was the vessel, the missing piece of his mountain empire. The first light of dawn crept through the frosted window as Mary Johnson stirred from a fitful sleep. She dreamed of being hunted, and the lingering unease followed her into wakefulness. Wrapping herself in a threadbare blanket, she shuffled to the cabin door, muscles tense with apprehension. When she cracked open the door, her breath caught in her throat. There, pressed into the thin layer of frost covering the ground, were footprints. Massive, deliberate impressions that certainly didn't belong to any woodland creature. They circled the cabin before disappearing into the tree line. "This isn't happening," she whispered, her words forming clouds in the frigid morning air. Mary knelt beside one print, her fingers hovering over the clear outline of a boot. The size alone made her stomach twist with dread. These weren't casual tracks from a lost hiker. Someone had been methodically circling her sanctuary, studying her vulnerabilities. She rose quickly, scanning the dense pines surrounding the clearing. The trees swayed gently, shadows shifting with the rising sun, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every dark space between trunks seemed to hide watchful eyes. "It's probably just a hunter," she told herself. though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Or a park ranger checking cabins. Her hand instinctively found the knife she now kept tucked in her belt, a simple tool that had become her constant companion. The weight of it offered little comfort as she retreated inside, bolting the door behind her. What Mary couldn't see was Robert Brown, crouched behind a granite outcropping 200 yards away. His broad frame was perfectly still as he watched her through a pair of battered binoculars. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, partially hidden beneath his unkempt beard. The woman's discovery of his tracks hadn't been an accident. He'd left them deliberately, testing her reaction, gauging her fear. Most city people would have fled immediately, but Mary had examined the prints with calculation rather than blind panic. "Smart girl," he muttered approvingly, lowering the binoculars. Her caution and resourcefulness only deepened his fixation. In his mind, these weren't merely desirable traits. They were necessary for survival in these mountains, for bearing and raising the sons he envisioned. Robert watched as Mary disappeared back into the cabin. Her defiance stirred something primal within him. He'd broken horses, tamed wilderness, and bent nature to his will for decades. This woman's spirit would be his greatest conquest. "Your fire will make them strong," he whispered to the empty air, already thinking of the children she would give him. Robert's obsession wasn't merely about companionship. It was about legacy, about extending his bloodline into the future of these mountains. He settled back against the cold stone, prepared to wait. The mountains had taught him patience above all else. Mary Johnson wasn't the helpless victim Robert imagined her to be. Growing up in the rougher neighborhoods of the city had taught her valuable lessons about survival. The streets had hardened her in ways that now proved unexpectedly useful in this wilderness. As the feeling of being watched intensified, her instincts from those difficult years kicked in. With methodical precision, she began setting crude traps around the perimeter of the cabin. Using twigs, rope from her backpack, and whatever else she could find, Mary created tripwires that would alert her to any approaching presence. She positioned them strategically, near the obvious approach paths, but leaving one route seemingly unguarded as a way to channel any intruder where she wanted them. Inside the cabin, she sat cross-legged on the floor, the knife from her pack balanced across her knees. The blade caught the firelight as she ran a smooth stone along its edge, sharpening it with steady, practiced strokes. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained remarkably still, fear channeled into purpose rather than panic. "I've survived worse," she whispered to herself, the mantra calming her nerves as memories of city dangers flashed through her mind. The knife had been a gift from her father years ago, practical, not sentimental, but now it represented her only real defense against whatever lurked outside. What Mary couldn't know was that Robert Brown watched her preparations from the tree line, his broad frame concealed behind a massive pine. A smile crept across his bearded face as he observed her setting the traps. There was something deeply satisfying about her resistance. It made the inevitable all the more rewarding. "Clever girl," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. With the practiced stealth of a man who'd lived decades in these woods, he tested one of her traps, deliberately triggering it when she wasn't looking toward the window. The subtle snap of twigs breaking would register as an animal to untrained ears. Robert stepped over the remaining tripwires with ease, examining her work with a hunter's appreciation. Her ingenuity impressed him. Most city people were helpless out here, but her defenses were child's play to a man who'd survived these mountains for so long. He had no desire to hurt Mary, at least not yet. In his twisted logic, she needed to come to him willingly or be broken to his will. Either way would serve his purpose. The mountain man retreated into the shadows, patient as the wilderness itself. The hunt was just beginning, and he had all the time in the world. The twilight painted the mountains in bruised purples and fading oranges as Mary Johnson stood at the cabin's threshold. Her breath caught in her throat when she heard it, a low, melodic humming carried on the wind. Not an animal, not the creaking trees. Human. Male. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her knife, knuckles white with tension. The sound lingered for several heartbeats before dissolving into the gathering darkness. Mary remained frozen, scanning the tree line, seeing nothing but shadows stretching like fingers toward her sanctuary. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Only silence answered. But she felt it, the weight of eyes upon her, the deliberate presence of someone watching, waiting. When morning came, Mary discovered the first sign. A stick, carefully whittled to a sharp point, its bark peeled away to reveal intricate carvings, spirals and jagged lines that resembled mountains. It hadn't been there yesterday. She picked it up, studying the craftsmanship, then hurled it into the trees with a frustrated cry. By midday, she found more evidence of her stalker. A careful stack of stones balanced outside her window, too deliberate to be natural. 5 smooth rocks, each larger than the one below, creating a small tower that seemed to mock her isolation. Mary kicked it over, her heart hammering against her ribs as she retreated inside. Robert watched from the shadow of a massive pine, satisfaction warming his chest. She had found his messages. Good. He wanted her aware, wanted the anticipation to build between them. The mountain man ran his calloused fingers through his beard, remembering how she had looked in the fading light, frightened but defiant, perfect for bearing strong sons. Soon, he whispered to himself, the word carried away by the bitter mountain air. That evening, as darkness fell like a shroud over the cabin, Mary heard it again, not humming this time, but words carried on the wind, too faint to make out completely. She pressed her ear against the wooden wall, knife clutched to her chest. Tonight, on. The voice was deep, gravelly. You're mine. The young woman backed away from the wall, bile rising in her throat. The words seemed to pulse in the air around her, a promise and a threat woven together. She barricaded the door with the rickety table, checked and rechecked the windows, and positioned herself in the corner with the clearest view of all entry points. The journal lay open beside her, but Mary couldn't bring herself to write. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the door, the knife steady in her hand. Sleep was impossible. Not tonight. Not with him out there, claiming her with words that chilled her deeper than the mountain frost. Mary Johnson sat rigid by the crackling fire, her knuckles white around the knife handle. Every pop of burning wood made her flinch. Every shadow dancing on the cabin walls seemed to take his shape. She hadn't slept in what felt like days, her eyes burning from staring at the wooden door, waiting for it to splinter open. The night stretched endlessly, a blanket of darkness pressing against the single window. She had barricaded herself as best she could, pushing the rickety table against the entrance. But the cabin's old walls had too many gaps, too many vulnerabilities. A cold draft whispered through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else. Something human. I should leave, she whispered to herself, voice hoarse from disuse. Her journal lay open beside her, filled with frantic notes and half-formed escape plans. But where would she go? The nearest town was miles away, across treacherous terrain, and night had transformed the mountains into an impenetrable maze. What had once seemed like a sanctuary now felt like an elaborate trap. Mary added another log to the fire, sparks flying upward. She thought of her apartment in the city, with its locks and neighbors and streetlights. The urban dangers she'd fled suddenly seemed manageable compared to this primal threat lurking in the wilderness. Outside, Robert Brown crouched low, his broad frame hidden in shadow. His beard collected frost as he remained motionless, watching her through a sliver in the cabin wall. The mountain man's breath came slow and measured, creating small clouds in the frigid night air. He could see her clearly, The tension in her shoulders, the fear in her movements, the determination in her grip on that pathetic knife. The sight of her terror stirred something deep within him, not pity, but satisfaction. The mountain had brought her to him, and now she was learning her place in his world. Robert shifted slightly, his axe resting silently beside him. He could break down that door with 3 solid swings, could take her tonight if he wanted. But the hunt was part of the ritual. The claiming had its own rhythm, as ancient as these peaks. He wanted to watch her spirit bend slowly, wanted to see the moment when she finally understood that resistance was futile. The mountain man smiled in the darkness, his weathered face creasing. "You're already mine," he whispered, words disappearing into the night. "You just don't know it yet." Inside, Mary shivered violently, though not from cold. Something told her she was being watched at that very moment. Her grip tightened on the knife as dawn remained agonizingly distant. Dawn broke over the mountains, heavy and gray, the pale light seeping through the cabin window like watery ink. Mary Johnson rose from her chair, stiff from another night of vigilance, and peered outside. The forest stood silent, almost mocking her fear with its stillness. She pulled on her boots and ventured out, knife tucked securely in her belt. The traps she had set remained untouched, not a single one disturbed. Mary circled the perimeter, examining each carefully crafted snare and tripwire. Nothing. Her stomach knotted as she realized whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly what she was doing. They were toying with her. "This isn't an animal," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. The mountains that had initially promised healing now felt like a vast prison, beautiful yet suffocating. The wild expanse that should have offered freedom instead closed around her like a fist. Mary ran her fingers through her tangled hair, exhaustion battling with determination. The city girl in her wanted to hide, to wait for rescue, but she knew better. No one was coming. This wilderness didn't care about her fear. It had seen countless terrors before her. Something inside her snapped. The fear transformed into rage, burning hot against the morning chill. Mary climbed onto a large rock near the cabin, her small frame silhouetted against the massive pines. "Show yourself!" she shouted, her voice cracking the silence like a whip. The words echoed through the trees, bouncing off distant ridges. "I know you're there! I'm not afraid of you!" The forest absorbed her challenge, returning only silence. But Mary stood her ground, scanning the tree line, the knife handle warm in her palm. This is my place. Most women he'd observed over the years cowered, whimpered, eventually fled. But not this one. Pride swelled in his chest as Mary continued her defiant stance. She was perfect, strong, resilient, a worthy vessel for his legacy. The fire in her would make his sons powerful, rulers of these mountains as he had been. "That's it, girl," he whispered to himself, his voice lost in the wind. "Fight, show me your strength." Robert remained motionless, patient as the ancient stones around him. The hunt was sweeter this way, and in his mind she was already his. The afternoon sun hung cold in the sky when Mary Johnson discovered the offering. Stepping outside to gather more firewood, her boot caught on something soft. She looked down and froze. A rabbit lay splayed across her doorstep, its belly cut open with surgical precision, entrails arranged in a deliberate pattern beside the carcass. Blood had pooled and frozen on the wooden planks, creating a dark, glossy stain. "Oh God," she whispered, stumbling backward, "this wasn't the work of a mountain lion or wolf." No animal would leave prey uneaten, displayed like some macabre gift. Her mind flashed to the footprints she'd found earlier, the feeling of being watched that had haunted her since arrival. Mary's hands trembled as she found a small garden shovel in the cabin's storage closet. She couldn't leave the rabbit there. Its dead eyes seemed to follow her, a warning of what might come. Digging into the frozen earth behind the cabin proved difficult. her knuckles turning white with effort and fear. "This is just to scare me," she muttered, trying to steady herself as she scooped dirt over the carcass. "I won't be frightened away." But her body betrayed her words. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and cold sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill. After burying the gruesome gift, she scrubbed the blood from the porch until her fingers were raw, as if erasing the stain could erase the threat. From his vantage point among the dense pines, Robert Brown watched her, satisfaction warming his chest despite the biting cold. The offering was a tradition older than the mountains themselves, a hunter's promise to provide. She didn't understand yet, but she would. The rabbit was just the beginning. First food, he whispered to himself, then protection, then sons. The progression was clear in his mind, inevitable as the changing seasons. Inside the cabin, Mary worked methodically to reinforce her defenses. She tested the lock on the door, finding it flimsy against any determined intruder. With desperate ingenuity, she wedged a chair under the doorknob and nailed boards across the window frames, turning her sanctuary into a fortress. Her journal lay open on the table, and she scribbled frantically. "Someone's out there, not an animal, a man, watching me." The rabbit was a message. As darkness fell, Robert circled the cabin once more, his heart pounding with anticipation. He touched the dried blood on the porch steps, a primal connection to the woman inside. The offering was made, the claim was staked. From tonight on, the hunt would truly begin. Night fell over the mountains like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seeped through the cabin walls. Mary Johnson moved methodically through the small space, her fingers trembling slightly as she attached a small bell to the door handle. The metallic sound it made when she tested it was reassuring. No one would enter without warning now. "Better than nothing," she whispered to herself, clutching the knife she'd kept close since discovering the footprints. The blade caught the firelight, reflecting her determined expression. Mary positioned herself in the corner of the room, back against the wall, where she could see both the door and the single window. The shadows danced across her face as she settled in for a long night. Outside, the forest was alive with night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of pine needles in the wind. But beneath these familiar noises lurked something more sinister. Robert Brown moved through the darkness with the ease of someone who belonged to the wilderness. His broad shoulders carried his axe effortlessly as he circled the cabin, studying its weaknesses. "You're mine, girl," he whispered into the night, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "For my sons." The words were swallowed by the wind, but he knew their power. The mountain man had waited years for someone like her, someone strong enough to survive these harsh conditions, someone worthy of continuing his bloodline. Inside, Mary's ears strained at every sound. The fire crackled, logs shifting and sending sparks up the chimney. She pulled her journal close, flipping through pages filled with sketches of mountain peaks and desperate plans. The cabin felt smaller tonight, the walls pressing in as if the entire mountain was conspiring against her. A branch snapped outside. The young woman froze, knife gripped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel it, a presence, a weight of attention focused entirely on her. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Robert placed a calloused hand against the cabin wall, feeling the warmth from the fire inside. He could almost sense her fear, and it stirred something primal within him. The isolation had twisted his understanding of connection, of belonging. In his mind, claiming her wasn't a crime, but destiny. "From tonight on," he murmured, "you exist for my legacy." The wind carried his words away, but Mary shivered suddenly, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, knife at the ready, determined to stay awake through the night. The bell on the door remained silent, but the weight of Robert's obsession pressed in from all sides. as inescapable as the mountains themselves. Mary Johnson stuffed her few belongings into her backpack with trembling hands. The cabin that had once promised healing now felt like a trap closing around her. 3 days of terror, the footprints, the gutted rabbit, the strange offerings were enough. Whatever dangers awaited in the city, they were familiar, human. This mountain held something primal that made her skin crawl. "I should have never come here," she whispered, zipping the backpack with finality. The journal went in last, pages filled with her mounting fear and determination. She tucked her knife into her belt, its weight reassuring against her hip. Mary took one final look around the cabin. The fire had died to embers, and morning light streamed through the foggy window. For a brief moment, she wondered if she was overreacting, if the isolation had simply gotten to her. Then she remembered the rabbit's blood, still dark against the wooden steps, and her resolve hardened. She pulled open the door, wincing at the creak of rusty hinges. The mountain air hit her face, crisp and clean, deceptively peaceful. 3 steps toward freedom, and her heart stopped. Robert Brown stood blocking the narrow path, his massive frame silhouetted against the trees. He seemed to have materialized from the wilderness itself, beard wild, clothes stained with earth and blood, eyes burning with an intensity that froze Mary in place. The axe hung casually from his calloused hand, its blade catching the morning light. "You're not leaving," he growled, his voice like stones grinding together. He took a step forward, and Mary instinctively stepped back, her hand finding the knife at her belt. The mountain man's gaze dropped to her packed bag, then back to her face. Something like disappointment crossed his features, quickly replaced by determination. "The mountains chose you. I chose you." Mary's mind raced through her limited options. The forest stretched endlessly behind him, and she knew he could track her easily through terrain he'd mastered over years of isolation. Still, she wouldn't show fear, wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Get out of my way," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. She pulled the knife free, holding it between them like a promise. Robert's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. He seemed almost impressed by her defiance, as if it confirmed something he'd suspected about her. The axe shifted in his grip, but he made no move to attack. "You've got spirit," he said, the words hanging in the cold air between them. "You'll need it." The air crackled with tension as Robert stepped closer, towering over Mary like the mountains themselves. His broad shoulders blocked out the morning light, casting her in shadow. Mary Johnson could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, but years of city survival had taught her never to show fear. "The mountains chose you," Robert Brown said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. His eyes, pale as winter ice, never left her face. "You're here for a reason, for me." Mary gripped her knife tighter, its handle warm and slick in her palm. The man before her seemed more beast than human, his beard wild and untamed, clothes stained with earth and animal blood. She could smell him, pine sap, smoke, and something primal. "I came here to heal," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not to be hunted." Robert's laugh rumbled like distant thunder. "Hunted? No. Chosen." He shifted his weight, and sunlight glinted off the axe head balanced on his shoulder. The weapon looked as natural in his grip as if it were an extension of his arm. Mary saw the wildness in his eyes, the possessive hunger that made her skin crawl. She took another step back, calculating the distance to the cabin door. Her city instincts screamed danger, but out here, there was no one to hear her scream. No alley to duck into, no crowd to disappear within. "I'm not your anything," she spat, backing toward the cabin, careful not to trip. Her fingers tightened around the knife. "I don't belong to you or these mountains." Robert's smile was chilling, revealing teeth worn from years of wilderness living. His certainty was absolute, as immovable as the stone cliffs surrounding them. "You will be," he said simply, as if stating a fact as obvious as the sky above them. "From tonight on, you exist to birth my sons." The words hung over her like a curse, heavy and suffocating. Mary felt bile rise in her throat as his meaning sank in. This wasn't just about possession, it was about legacy, about forcing her to carry his bloodline forward into this desolate place. "You're insane," she whispered. But the wind carried her words away. Robert stepped forward again, his massive frame blocking any escape route except the cabin behind her. "The mountains need new blood," he said. "My sons need a mother. You'll understand soon enough." Mary's back hit the rough wooden wall of the cabin. She felt the door handle against her spine, her only chance at temporary safety. Robert's eyes never left hers, patient and predatory, as if he had all the time in the world. Because in his mind, he did. She was already his. Mary Johnson lunged for the cabin door, slamming it with such force that dust particles danced in the cold air. Her hands trembled as she dragged the rickety wooden table across the floor, wedging it firmly against the entrance. Her chest heaved with each ragged breath, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chill. Outside, Robert stood motionless, his massive silhouette visible through the frosted window. He made no attempt to force his way in, just waited, patient as the mountains themselves. "You'll see," he called, his voice carrying through the thin walls like a winter wind. "The mountains don't let go. They've chosen you, same as they chose me." Mary clutched her knife with white knuckles, the blade catching the dim light from the fireplace. The weight of it in her palm was reassuring, a connection to her strength. She'd grown up fighting. The city had taught her that survival wasn't given, it was taken. "I need to think," she whispered to herself, pacing the small confines of what had become her prison. The cabin's walls seemed to inch closer with each passing moment, the ceiling lower, the air thinner. What had once been a sanctuary now felt like a trap, with Robert as its waiting jaws. She inventoried her supplies, food for 3 more days, water from the stream nearby, her knife, and the fierce determination burning in her chest. The journal lay open on the bed, her earlier entries about healing and peace now seeming naive and distant. "I'm not his victim," Mary muttered, gripping the knife tighter. "I won't be anyone's anything." She peered through a crack in the wooden shutters. Robert had moved to sit on a fallen log, his axe balanced across his knees, his eyes never leaving the cabin. He looked like he could wait forever. Mary considered her options. Fighting him directly would be suicide. He outweighed her by at least 100 pounds of muscle, hardened by years in the wilderness. Running meant navigating treacherous mountain trails he knew intimately. Staying meant slow starvation or eventual capture. She pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold floor. The cabin creaked around her, as if speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Outside, the mountains loomed indifferent to her plight, ancient and unmoved by human suffering. "I'll do whatever it takes," she promised herself, running her thumb along the knife's edge. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't yield. The city had forged her in fires Robert couldn't imagine, and if he thought she'd simply accept his twisted fantasy, he'd learn just how wrong he was. The minutes dragged into hours as Mary Johnson remained crouched near the window, her muscles aching from the constant tension. Every few moments, her eyes darted to the glass pane, searching for movement in the darkness beyond. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. But she dared not add more wood. The light would only make her more visible to him. Outside, Robert paced. She could hear his heavy footsteps, sometimes near the door, sometimes circling to the back of the cabin, sometimes disappearing altogether only to return with deliberate slowness. The sound was maddening, like a pendulum marking time until her inevitable capture. His presence seemed to seep through the wooden walls like a poisonous mist. "He's trying to wear me down," she whispered to herself, clutching her knife so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Mary pulled her journal from her pack and sketched a crude map by the dim firelight. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with the main trail leading down toward the town miles away. There was the ridge to the east where she'd first sensed his watching eyes, and the steep drop to the west that would be impossible to navigate in darkness. She marked the places where she'd seen him, trying to understand his patterns, his territory. "There has to be a way," she muttered, tracing possible escape routes with her fingertip. The mountains weren't just his domain. They could be her ally if she was smart enough, quick enough. She wrote in her journal, pressing the pen hard against the paper. "He's a monster, but I'm not his prey. I refuse to be. Whatever happens, I won't break." The words strengthened her resolve, a promise to herself that she intended to keep. The young woman checked her supplies. The knife, a small flashlight, some food, water, enough to make it to town if she could slip away unnoticed. She tested the floorboards, looking for one that might not creak, planning each step of her escape. The cabin fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Mary froze, listening intently. The absence of sound was more terrifying than his pacing had been. Then, at midnight, 3 heavy knocks rattled the door on its hinges. The sound was so sudden, so definitive, that Mary's heart nearly stopped. The bell she'd rigged jingled softly, a feeble warning against the imminent danger. "I know you're awake," Robert's deep voice rumbled through the wood. "We need to talk." Mary didn't answer. She gripped her knife and pressed her back against the wall, eyes fixed on the door, waiting. "Open the door," he growled, his voice seeping through the wooden planks like poison. "We talk, or I come in." The cabin walls suddenly felt paper-thin to Mary Johnson as she gripped her knife tighter, knuckles white with determination. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door, breathing as quietly as possible. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared he might hear it. The makeshift bell jingled softly, a warning system crafted from desperation. Robert was testing the door, his massive fingers probing for weaknesses in her fortress. Mary bit her lip to keep from making a sound. The handle rattled once, twice, then stopped. Silence stretched between them, more terrifying than his threats. "You can't hide forever," he finally said, his voice oddly gentle now. "The mountains chose you. I chose you." Mary remained frozen, knife ready, her mind racing through scenarios of what might happen if the door gave way. The rough handle of the blade felt reassuring against her palm, a connection to her strength, her refusal to become his possession. Minutes stretched into an hour. The floorboards creaked as she finally dared to move, muscles stiff from standing motionless. Had he gone? The silence felt like another trap. When dawn broke, pale light filtering through the fogged window, Mary cautiously approached the door. No sounds came from outside. Holding her breath, she moved the table barricade just enough to peek through a crack. There, on the doorstep, lay something that made her stomach lurch. A bracelet woven from vines and what appeared to be small animal bones, bleached white by the sun. The craftsmanship was intricate, almost beautiful in its savagery. A wedding band from hell. Mary retrieved it using a stick, unwilling to touch it with her bare hands. The object seemed to pulse with Robert's obsession, his claim on her. She carried it to the fireplace, where embers still glowed from the night before. "I am not yours," she whispered, dropping the bracelet into the flames. "I will never be yours." The bones cracked in the heat, and the vines curled and blackened. Mary watched it burn, a small act of defiance that strengthened her resolve. The smoke carried her rejection up the chimney, a message to the mountains themselves. Outside, hidden among the pines, Robert Brown watched the thin trail of smoke rising from her cabin. His jaw clenched as he understood her answer. She was strong. stronger than he'd anticipated. His weathered face hardened with determination. The rejection didn't deter him. It only made the hunt more thrilling. Mary Johnson had spent the entire day meticulously planning her escape. The winding trail to town stretched for miles through treacherous terrain. But anything was better than becoming a prisoner to a madman's twisted fantasy. She waited until the mountain shadows grew long, casting the forest in deepening shades of purple and blue. With trembling hands, she packed only essentials into her small backpack: her journal, a water bottle, and what little food she could spare. Every few minutes, she peered through the cabin's foggy window, searching for any sign of her stalker. The silence outside was deceptive, heavy with anticipation. When dusk finally settled over the mountains, Mary carefully pushed open the back window, wincing at each subtle creak of the aged wood. She slipped through the narrow opening, her movements deliberate and controlled. Years of navigating rough city streets had taught her to move silently when necessary. She lowered herself to the ground, mimicking the cautious grace of the deer she'd observed from her window during those long, isolated days. The forest floor felt soft beneath her boots as she crept away from the cabin, staying low and using the trees for cover. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might give her away. 20 yards. 50. She was doing it, escaping this nightmare. Then a twig snapped behind her. Before Mary could fully turn, Robert Brown emerged from the shadows like a mountain taking human form. His massive frame blocked what little light remained in the forest. She hadn't been stealthy enough, or perhaps he'd never left at all, anticipating her every move. "You don't run from fate," he growled, his voice rumbling like distant thunder as his calloused hand clamped around her forearm with crushing force. Mary felt the cold metal of her knife against her hip. Without hesitation, she drew the blade and plunged it deep into his hand. Robert howled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough. She twisted free, adrenaline surging through her veins as she bolted into the darkening forest. Behind her, his agonized roar echoed through the trees, bouncing off rock faces and sending birds scattering into the twilight sky. "I'll find you," he bellowed, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. Mary ran blindly, branches whipping her face, roots threatening to trip her with each desperate stride. The forest swallowed her whole as darkness descended completely, but she pressed on, her city-hardened resolve refusing to break. She was no longer prey. She was a survivor, and the mountains would not claim her. The mountains transformed into a terrifying maze as Mary Johnson fled, her urban upbringing becoming her salvation. Each step carried her deeper into the wilderness, her lungs burning with exertion, but her mind remained sharp. The young woman remembered every survival skill she'd learned on city streets: how to disappear, how to mislead, how to become a ghost. Behind her, Robert crashed through the underbrush like a wounded bear. His hand throbbed where her knife had pierced it, blood dripping onto fallen leaves. "You can't escape me," he bellowed, voice echoing across the valley. "These mountains are mine." Mary moved with calculated precision, doubling back on her trail and creating false paths. She broke branches in misleading directions and crossed icy streams to mask her scent. The skills that once protected her from urban predators now shielded her from this mountain monster. At the cliff's edge, she paused, heart hammering against her ribs. Below stretched a dizzying drop into fog-shrouded rocks. The bearded man's heavy footfalls grew closer, his breathing audible even over the howling wind. With no other choice, she spotted a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for her boots, and inched along it, back pressed against cold stone. "You exist for me," Robert's voice carried on the wind. "For my sons." The ledge led to a hidden cave, its entrance nearly invisible among the rocks. Mary slipped inside, crouching in darkness as her pursuer's shadow passed by. She clutched her knife, knuckles white, prepared to fight if discovered. Hours passed in tense silence, her journal pressed against her chest like a shield. When dawn broke, she emerged cautiously. The mountain air tasted different now, like freedom rather than fear. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of town lights. Salvation was within reach. Mary made her final push towards civilization, every sense alert for signs of the mountain man. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had faced the worst of humanity and survived. Robert Brown, wounded both physically and in his twisted pride, retreated into the wilderness. The locals would later speak of a haunted roar that echoed through the valleys that morning. The sound of obsession denied its prize. When Mary finally reached the town, she looked back at the mountains one last time. She knew she would never return, but she also knew something fundamental had changed within her. The trauma hadn't broken her. It had forged her into something stronger. His words would echo in her nightmares, but they would never again control her waking hours. She had survived the mountain's cruel test, and in doing so, reclaimed herself.